I'm Alex, 29, and I thought my father's retirement party would be a celebration of his 30-year career as a respected police detective. Instead, it became the moment he looked me in the eye in front of 60 colleagues, friends, and family members and declared, "You're the biggest disgrace to this family, Alex. While your brother serves his country with honor, you've chosen to defend the criminals I spent my career putting away." The room went silent as I stood up, raised my champagne glass, and said the words that would destroy his reputation forever. "Speaking of criminals, Dad, should I tell everyone about your evidence tampering in the Morrison case, or would you prefer to resign before Internal Affairs gets my testimony?" What happened next didn't just end his retirement party, it ended his entire legacy and exposed corruption that would send him to the same prison system he'd spent decades feeding. What would you have done if your parent humiliated you like this in front of everyone who mattered in their professional life? Would you have stayed silent to protect family? Walked away quietly? Or exposed the truth that would destroy them completely? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe because this story of family betrayal and police corruption is about to get absolutely explosive. To understand how my father's retirement party humiliation became the catalyst for exposing decades of police corruption and destroying our family's carefully constructed image, you need to know about the toxic dynamic that had defined our household for my entire life. My father, Detective Robert Sterling, was a decorated 30-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Department who'd built his reputation on high-profile arrests and a conviction rate that made him a poster child for effective law enforcement. Our family was considered police royalty in our community. My older brother Marcus had followed perfectly in our father's footsteps, joining the military after high school and eventually becoming a decorated Army officer who'd served multiple tours overseas. Marcus embodied everything our father valued: patriotism, authority, discipline, and an unwavering belief in the justice system that had defined our father's entire career. When Marcus spoke at family gatherings, it was always about honor, duty, and service to country, themes that made our father beam with pride. Then there was me, Alex, the family disappointment who'd chosen to become a criminal defense attorney. In our father's worldview, my career choice wasn't just different from his preferences, it was a direct betrayal of everything he'd worked to achieve. Every criminal I successfully defended was someone like the suspects he'd arrested. Every prosecution I challenged was an attack on the system he'd devoted his life to supporting. My professional success was measured by how effectively I could undermine the work that defined his identity. The tension between my career and my father's values had been building for years, but it had reached a breaking point over the past 18 months as I'd begun specializing in cases involving police misconduct and wrongful convictions. My law firm had developed a reputation for taking on difficult cases where suspects claimed they'd been framed or coerced into confessions, work that put me in direct opposition to the police culture that had shaped our family's identity. Our father had made his disapproval of my career choice clear through constant criticism and public embarrassment at family gatherings. When relatives asked about my legal practice, he would make jokes about me helping criminals escape justice or suggest that I'd chosen the easy money of defending guilty people rather than the honorable work of protecting society. The psychological pressure to change careers or at least practice a different type of law was relentless. But what made our father's criticism particularly painful was how it contrasted with his treatment of Marcus, whose military service earned constant praise and public celebration. Every promotion Marcus received was announced at family gatherings and shared on social media as evidence of our family's commitment to service and honor. Marcus's achievements were presented as validation of our father's parenting and values, while my legal career was treated as an embarrassing aberration that reflected poorly on our family's character. The favoritism extended beyond simple pride in achievements to active support for our different career paths. When Marcus needed financial help during military training or deployment-related expenses, our father was generous and supportive. When I'd struggled with law school debt and bar exam costs, the response was lectures about making better financial choices and suggestions that I should have chosen a more practical career that wouldn't require expensive education. Family gatherings had become exercises in enduring subtle and not-so-subtle criticism about my life choices while watching Marcus be celebrated for embodying our father's ideals. The psychological impact was devastating because it positioned my professional success as family disloyalty, making every career achievement feel like a personal betrayal of the man who'd raised me. But what our father didn't know, what none of my family knew, was that my legal work had uncovered evidence of systematic corruption within his own police department, including specific cases where I had documented proof of his involvement in evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to frame innocent suspects. The criminal defense work he'd been criticizing for months had actually revealed that he was one of the criminals I'd been unknowingly investigating. The evidence had emerged gradually through multiple cases involving suspects who'd been arrested by my father's detective unit. Too many clients had similar stories about evidence that appeared or disappeared conveniently, witnesses who changed their testimony after talking to police, and confessions that had been obtained through coercion and intimidation rather than legitimate investigation. The pattern was so consistent that I'd begun documenting every case that involved officers from my father's precinct. The most damning evidence had come from the Morrison case, where my client had been charged with armed robbery based primarily on testimony from a witness who'd initially told police he couldn't identify the suspect. After reviewing discovery materials and interviewing the witness privately, I'd learned that Detective Robert Sterling had pressured him to change his testimony through threats about immigration status and promises of favorable treatment in an unrelated case. But the Morrison case was just the tip of the iceberg. My investigation had revealed that my father had been systematically manipulating evidence and witness testimony for years, building his impressive conviction rate through corruption rather than competent police work. The reputation that had made him a respected figure in law enforcement was built on a foundation of criminal behavior that had destroyed innocent lives while allowing actual criminals to escape justice. The irony was devastating and complete. The father who'd spent years criticizing me for defending criminals was actually one of the worst criminals I'd ever encountered in my legal practice. The man who lectured me about honor and justice had been systematically violating both principles throughout his career. The parent who positioned my brother and himself as heroes serving society had actually been one of the people my legal work was designed to stop. For months, I'd been struggling with the knowledge that my own father was a corrupt police officer whose crimes I was ethically and legally obligated to expose. The evidence I'd gathered could destroy not just his career but also his freedom, as the crimes he'd committed carried serious federal penalties that would likely result in decades in prison. But he was still my father, and the thought of being responsible for his imprisonment was psychologically devastating. The retirement party was supposed to be a celebration of his distinguished career and transition to a well-earned retirement funded by a generous police pension. Instead, it became the moment when his cruelty finally pushed me beyond my capacity for protecting someone who'd been systematically destroying innocent lives while criticizing me for defending them. The discovery of my father's corruption had begun 6 months earlier with what seemed like a routine case, defending a young man named David Chen who'd been charged with armed robbery based on what appeared to be solid police work and witness testimony. David was a college student with no criminal record who insisted he'd been studying in the library when the robbery occurred, but his alibi couldn't be verified through security cameras that had mysteriously malfunctioned that day. What initially seemed like a straightforward case with weak but legitimate evidence gradually revealed itself as an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by Detective Robert Sterling and his partner, Detective Maria Santos. The witness who'd initially been unable to identify David in a lineup had suddenly become certain of his identification after several conversations with my father. The physical evidence that supposedly linked David to the crime had appeared in police reports after initial forensic examinations had found no connection. My investigation into David's case had been thorough and professional, as I'd learned to be when dealing with cases involving questionable police work. But what I'd discovered went far beyond normal prosecutorial overzealousness or investigative mistakes. The evidence pointed to deliberate manipulation of witnesses, fabrication of physical evidence, and coordination between officers to build cases against suspects they knew were innocent. The breakthrough had come when I'd managed to interview the robbery witness privately, away from police influence and intimidation. Under careful questioning, he'd revealed that Detective Sterling had pressured him to change his identification through threats about his immigration status and promises of favorable treatment in an unrelated drug possession case. The witness had been coerced into sending an innocent man to prison to protect himself from deportation. But David Chen's case wasn't an isolated incident. As I'd begun investigating other cases involving my father's detective unit, a pattern of corruption had emerged that was both systematic and extensive. Over the past 5 years, Detective Sterling had been involved in over 30 cases where evidence had appeared or disappeared conveniently, witnesses had changed their testimony after police interviews, and suspects had confessed to crimes they insisted they hadn't committed. The most disturbing aspect of my investigation was learning that my father's corruption wasn't limited to building cases against innocent suspects. He'd also been protecting actual criminals who provided him with information or financial incentives. Drug dealers, gang members, and white-collar criminals had been receiving favorable treatment in exchange for cooperation that enhanced my father's reputation while allowing dangerous people to continue harming our community. The evidence I'd collected included recorded conversations with witnesses who described police intimidation, forensic reports that had been altered after initial examinations, and financial records showing unexplained deposits into accounts controlled by my father and his partner. The documentation was comprehensive enough to support federal charges for conspiracy, civil rights violations, and racketeering that could result in decades in prison. But perhaps the most damaging evidence was a recording I'd obtained of my father discussing case manipulation with Detective Santos. The conversation, captured during a wiretap operation in an unrelated case, included explicit acknowledgement of evidence tampering and witness intimidation, along with discussions about which suspects to frame and which criminals to protect based on their value as informants or sources of additional income. The psychological impact of learning that my own father was a corrupt police officer had been devastating beyond anything I'd experienced in my personal or professional life. The man who'd raised me to value honesty and justice had been systematically violating both principles throughout my adult life. The parent who'd criticized my career choice as morally questionable had been committing crimes that made my clients look like saints by comparison. The ethical implications were equally complex because my duty as an attorney required me to expose corruption and protect innocent clients, but my role as a son made me reluctant to destroy my father's career and freedom. The evidence I'd gathered could exonerate multiple innocent people who were currently in prison based on my father's fraudulent police work, but it would also result in his prosecution and imprisonment. For months, I'd been hoping that my father would retire quietly and that his corruption could be addressed through internal police department procedures rather than criminal prosecution. I'd considered approaching him privately to suggest that he seek early retirement or transfer to a position where he couldn't continue harming innocent people. But his continued criticism of my career and his public humiliation of me at family gatherings had made private conversation impossible. The retirement party had initially seemed like the perfect opportunity for him to leave law enforcement before his crimes were exposed and prosecuted. If he'd simply celebrated his career achievements and transitioned to civilian life gracefully, I might have been willing to let sleeping dogs lie rather than destroying our family through criminal prosecution. But his decision to use his retirement celebration as another opportunity to humiliate me professionally had finally pushed me beyond my tolerance for protecting someone who didn't deserve protection. What made his retirement party attack particularly infuriating was that he'd chosen to criticize my work defending innocent clients while being unaware that some of those clients had been framed by his own criminal behavior. The father who was lecturing me about defending criminals was actually one of the worst criminals I'd ever encountered, and his criticism of my legal work was projection of his own guilt about the crimes he'd been committing throughout his career. The audience for his public humiliation of me included many of his police colleagues, some of whom I suspected were aware of his corruption but had remained silent to protect their own careers and reputations. His choice to attack my character in front of people who knew about his criminal behavior made his hypocrisy even more glaring and his cruelty more inexcusable. As I'd sat at his retirement party, listening to speeches about his distinguished career and dedication to justice, I'd been carrying documentation that proved he was a fraud who'd built his reputation through systematic violation of every principle he claimed to represent. The cognitive dissonance of watching him be celebrated for achievements that were actually crimes had finally convinced me that protecting him was less important than protecting the innocent people he'd victimized. The retirement party for Detective Robert Sterling was everything you'd expect for a decorated police officer with 30 years of distinguished service, or at least, everything you'd expect if you didn't know that his distinguished service was actually 3 decades of systematic corruption and criminal behavior. The venue was packed with police brass, city officials, family friends, and colleagues who'd gathered to celebrate a career that they believed represented the best of law enforcement values and dedication to justice. The atmosphere was festive and celebratory as speakers took turns praising my father's investigative skills, his impressive conviction rate, and his commitment to protecting our community from dangerous criminals. The police chief spoke about Detective Sterling's unwavering dedication to justice and his exemplary record of successful prosecutions that made our streets safer. The irony was devastating for me, knowing that many of those successful prosecutions had been built on fabricated evidence and coerced testimony. My brother Marcus had flown in from his military base to deliver a speech about our father's influence on his own commitment to service and honor. Marcus spoke eloquently about growing up in a household where integrity and duty were paramount values, and how our father's example had inspired his own military career. The pride in his voice was genuine and heartfelt, but it was based on a completely false understanding of who our father really was and what his career had actually accomplished. I'd been seated at the family table, trying to smile and appear supportive while internally struggling with the knowledge that everything being said about my father's career was either misguided or completely false. Every story about his investigative brilliance was actually evidence of his ability to manipulate evidence and intimidate witnesses. Every praise for his conviction rate was celebration of innocent people being sent to prison through fraud. The tension had been building throughout the evening as speaker after speaker celebrated achievements that I knew were criminal. But the breaking point came when my father took the podium for his own remarks and decided to use the occasion not just to reflect on his career, but to publicly attack my professional choices and character in front of everyone who mattered in his law enforcement world. I've been blessed to work alongside some of the finest officers in the country, he began, his voice carrying the authority and confidence that had made him a respected figure in law enforcement. We've dedicated our careers to protecting innocent people from criminals who would harm them, and I'm proud of the role we've played in making our community safer. The audience nodded appreciatively as he continued building toward what I sensed would be a personal attack on my career. But I have to say, one of the most disappointing aspects of my career has been watching criminals escape justice through legal technicalities and defense attorneys who care more about winning cases than protecting society. The direction of his remarks was becoming clear, and I felt my hands clenching under the table as he prepared to publicly humiliate me at his own retirement celebration. The man whose criminal behavior I'd been documenting for months was about to lecture a room full of law enforcement officials about the moral failures of defense attorneys. Some people choose careers that serve the greater good, he continued, his eyes finding mine across the room, while others choose careers that serve only themselves. It pains me to say this, but I've watched my own son choose to defend the very criminals I've spent my career arresting, putting guilty people back on the streets to harm more innocent victims. The room was getting uncomfortable as it became clear that he was using his retirement speech to attack his own son's career, but he wasn't finished with his character assassination. The public nature of his criticism made it particularly cruel and calculated, designed to humiliate me in front of people whose opinions mattered in law enforcement circles. "You're the biggest disgrace to this family, Alex," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "While your brother serves his country with honor, you've chosen to defend the criminals I spent my career putting away. You've made a mockery of everything this family stands for, and frankly, I'm ashamed to call you my son." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Police officers, city officials, and family friends were clearly shocked by the public nature of his attack on his own child. Some people were looking at their plates, others were staring at me with pity or curiosity, and a few were clearly questioning whether my father's behavior was appropriate for what was supposed to be a celebration. But what my father didn't know, what no one in that room knew except me, was that his public attack on my character and career had just provided me with the perfect justification for exposing the truth about his own criminal behavior. The man who'd just called me a disgrace for defending innocent clients was about to learn what real disgrace looked like when his own crimes were revealed to everyone who'd been celebrating his distinguished career. I stood up slowly, picking up my champagne glass with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. The room was still silent, waiting to see how I would respond to such a brutal public attack from my own father. Some people probably expected me to leave quietly or attempt to defuse the situation with humor or deflection. None of them expected what actually happened next. "Thank you for that heartfelt assessment of my character, Dad," I said, my voice calm but carrying clearly across the room. "Since we're sharing honest opinions about family members' careers tonight, I think it's only fair that I share some information about yours." The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately as people sensed that the evening was about to take an even more dramatic turn. My father's face showed confusion mixed with dawning alarm as he realized that I might be prepared to retaliate for his public humiliation. But he couldn't have anticipated the scope of what I was about to reveal. "Speaking of criminals, Dad," I continued, raising my champagne glass in a mock toast, "should I tell everyone about your evidence tampering in the Morrison case, or would you prefer to resign before Internal Affairs gets my testimony about your systematic corruption over the past 5 years?" The explosion of shocked gasps and confused murmurs that followed my words was exactly what I'd expected, but the look of absolute terror on my father's face was more satisfying than I'd imagined. The man who'd just called me the biggest disgrace to our family was about to discover what real disgrace looked like when a 30-year career built on lies and criminal behavior was exposed in front of everyone who'd been celebrating his achievements. The silence that followed my threat to expose my father's corruption lasted only seconds before the room erupted in confused whispers and shocked murmurs as 60 law enforcement officials, city leaders, and family members tried to process what they'd just heard. My father's face had gone from confident authority to absolute terror as he realized that his public attack on my character had triggered my decision to reveal information that would destroy not just his retirement celebration, but his entire legacy and freedom. Police Chief Margaret Rodriguez was the first to find her voice, her law enforcement training helping her move quickly from shock to damage control mode. "Alex, that's a very serious accusation. Are you saying you have evidence of criminal behavior by Detective Sterling?" Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes as she weighed the political implications of corruption allegations against one of her most decorated officers. "I'm saying that I have documented evidence of systematic evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to frame innocent suspects," I replied, my voice gaining strength as I realized there was no going back from this moment. Over the past 6 months, I'd been investigating cases involving Detective Sterling's unit, and what I've found amounts to one of the most extensive corruption scandals in this department's history. The reaction from my father's police colleagues was immediate and telling. Some officers looked genuinely shocked and confused, clearly unaware of any corruption within their ranks. But others exchanged glances that suggested this wasn't the first time questions had been raised about Detective Sterling's methods. A few veteran officers started moving toward the exits, apparently recognizing that they didn't want to be present for what was about to unfold. My brother Marcus looked devastated as he processed the implications of what I was saying. His entire worldview was built around respect for law enforcement and military authority, and the possibility that our father was a corrupt police officer was shaking the foundation of everything he believed about family, duty, and service. "Alex, what are you talking about? Dad's one of the most respected officers in the department." "That's exactly the problem, Marcus," I said, turning to address not just him but the entire room. "Dad's reputation for successful prosecutions isn't based on excellent police work, it's based on fabricating evidence and coercing witnesses into false testimony. The conviction rate everyone's been celebrating tonight was achieved through systematic violation of suspects' constitutional rights." Detective Maria Santos, my father's longtime partner, had gone pale as she realized that my investigation might have uncovered her own involvement in the corruption scheme. Her attempt to defend my father was weak and unconvincing. "Detective Sterling has always followed proper procedures. Whatever you think you found must be based on misunderstanding police investigative techniques." "Is threatening witnesses about their immigration status a proper investigative technique, Detective Santos?" I asked, pulling out my phone and opening the audio recording app. Because I have a recorded conversation where you and my father discuss exactly which threats were most effective in getting witnesses to change their testimony in cases where you knew the suspects were innocent. The mention of recorded evidence caused another wave of shocked responses, but this time several officers were clearly preparing to leave rather than risk being implicated in whatever revelations were coming next. The festive retirement celebration had transformed into a criminal investigation, and people were beginning to understand that they might be witnessing the exposure of crimes that could result in federal prosecution. My father finally found his voice, but his response was predictable and pathetic. Alex is obviously lying because he's angry about my criticism of his career choices. He's trying to destroy my reputation out of spite and vindictiveness. The desperation in his voice was obvious as he realized that his public attack on me had triggered the revelation of information that would destroy him completely. Actually, Dad, I'm not lying, and I can prove it, I said, gesturing toward my briefcase, which contained copies of the evidence I'd been collecting for months. I have forensic reports showing evidence tampering, witness statements describing police intimidation, financial records showing unexplained income, and recorded conversations where you explicitly discuss framing innocent suspects. The police chief's law enforcement instincts were taking over as she recognized that this situation required immediate investigation and damage control. Detective Sterling, I'm going to need you to report to Internal Affairs first thing Monday morning. Alex, I'm going to need you to provide all of your evidence to investigators immediately. But I wasn't finished exposing the scope of my father's corruption. The retirement party that was supposed to celebrate his distinguished career was going to become a comprehensive revelation of criminal behavior that would shock everyone who thought they knew Detective Robert Sterling. The Morrison case is just one example, I continued, my voice growing stronger as I realized that I was finally free to tell the truth about what I'd discovered. Over the past 5 years, Detective Sterling has been involved in systematic corruption that includes evidence tampering in at least 30 cases, witness intimidation in dozens more, and financial kickbacks from criminals who were protected in exchange for information or money. The scope of the corruption I was describing was clearly overwhelming for people who'd spent the evening celebrating what they believed was an exemplary law enforcement career. Several family friends were openly staring at my father with horror and disbelief, while police colleagues were beginning to distance themselves physically and emotionally from someone who was being revealed as a criminal. You have no idea what police work actually involves, my father said, his voice rising with desperation as he tried to salvage some credibility. Sometimes we have to make difficult choices to protect society from dangerous criminals. You've spent your career helping guilty people escape justice, so you don't understand the complexity of real law enforcement. I understand that framing innocent people isn't complex, Dad, it's criminal, I replied with calm authority. And I understand that taking bribes from drug dealers to look the other way isn't police work, it's corruption. The man you've been celebrating tonight isn't a hero who protects society. He's a criminal who's been systematically destroying innocent lives while protecting actual criminals for personal gain. The devastation on Marcus's face was heartbreaking as he realized that his father, his hero and role model, was being credibly accused of serious crimes by his own son. Alex, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you're exaggerating or misunderstanding something. The plea in his voice showed how desperately he wanted to maintain his faith in our father's integrity. I wish I could, Marcus, but the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable, I said, feeling genuine sympathy for my brother's pain. The father we thought we knew doesn't exist. The man who raised us to value honesty and justice has been lying and obstructing justice throughout our adult lives. The room was beginning to empty as people realized that they were witnessing the destruction of a respected police officer's career and reputation through credible allegations of serious criminal behavior. Some attendees were clearly uncomfortable being associated with what was unfolding, while others were probably concerned about their own potential exposure if the corruption investigation expanded beyond Detective Sterling. But the most satisfying moment came when I saw the look of complete defeat on my father's face as he realized that his public humiliation of me had triggered the exposure of crimes that would send him to prison and destroy everything he'd worked to build. The man who'd called me the biggest disgrace to our family was about to become the real disgrace, a corrupt police officer whose criminal behavior had victimized innocent people while enriching himself. The retirement party that was supposed to celebrate 30 years of distinguished service was ending with the revelation that those 30 years had been built on systematic criminal behavior that would result in federal prosecution and decades in prison. Within 72 hours of my explosive revelation at my father's retirement party, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit had launched a comprehensive investigation into Detective Robert Sterling and his associates that would ultimately expose one of the largest police corruption scandals in our city's history. The evidence I'd provided as a starting point led federal investigators to uncover a network of criminal behavior that extended far beyond my father's individual crimes to include multiple officers, prosecutors, and even judges who'd been complicit in systematic violation of suspects' constitutional rights. The federal task force assigned to the case included FBI agents specializing in civil rights violations, federal prosecutors with experience in police corruption cases, and forensic accountants who could trace the financial benefits that had motivated years of criminal behavior. The scope and sophistication of their investigation was overwhelming, involving surveillance operations, financial audits, and witness interviews that painted a comprehensive picture of corruption within our local law enforcement system. My father's attempts to minimize the scandal and control the narrative had been pathetic and unsuccessful. His initial strategy of claiming that I was a disgruntled son seeking revenge had collapsed when federal investigators reviewed the evidence and confirmed that my allegations were not only credible but actually understated the scope of his criminal behavior. The recorded conversations, altered forensic reports, and financial records I'd provided were just the beginning of what investigators would ultimately discover. Detective Maria Santos had been arrested within a week of the retirement party revelation, and her cooperation with federal investigators had provided additional evidence that implicated not just my father but also other officers in their unit who'd been participating in or aware of the corruption scheme. The conspiracy was larger and more systematic than I'd realized, involving coordination between patrol officers, detectives, and supervisors who'd been protecting each other while victimizing innocent suspects. The media attention surrounding the investigation had been intense and devastating for my father's reputation and our family's standing in the community. Local news outlets had covered the story extensively, focusing on the irony of a decorated police detective being exposed by his own son and the shocking scope of corruption that had been hidden behind a facade of distinguished service. National media had picked up the story as an example of how police corruption could persist for years without detection. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the investigation was watching how quickly my father's law enforcement colleagues had abandoned him once his criminal behavior was exposed. The police officers who'd celebrated his career at the retirement party were now distancing themselves from someone whose corruption threatened their own reputations and careers. The fraternal loyalty that had protected him for years evaporated overnight when it became clear that association with him was professionally toxic. The charges filed against my father were comprehensive and carried sentences that would effectively end his life as he knew it. Federal prosecutors had indicted him on 43 counts including civil rights violations, conspiracy, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and racketeering charges that carried a potential sentence of over 100 years in prison. The man who'd spent 30 years sending people to prison was facing the prospect of dying behind bars himself. The civil lawsuits filed by wrongfully convicted defendants were equally devastating, as my evidence had led to the exoneration of 11 innocent people who'd been imprisoned based on my father's fraudulent police work. The financial liability for false imprisonment, civil rights violations, and emotional distress was estimated at over $15 million, money that would have to be paid by taxpayers who'd trusted their police department to operate with integrity. My brother Marcus's reaction to learning the full scope of our father's crimes had been devastating to watch. The man who'd built his identity around service, honor, and duty was forced to confront the reality that his role model and inspiration was actually a criminal whose behavior violated every value Marcus held sacred. His request for compassionate reassignment within the military reflected his understanding that association with our family name had become a professional liability. The impact on our extended family had been equally severe, as relatives who'd been proud of our father's law enforcement career were now dealing with the shame and embarrassment of being related to someone whose corruption had become a national news story. Family gatherings were cancelled, social media accounts were deactivated, and several relatives had changed their names to distance themselves from the scandal. But the most meaningful consequence was the validation of my career choices that my father had spent years criticizing. The criminal defense work he'd mocked as morally questionable had actually exposed systematic corruption that had victimized innocent people for years. The legal system he'd claimed I was undermining through my advocacy for defendants' rights had been systematically corrupted by his own criminal behavior. My law firm had been contacted by dozens of former defendants who suspected their cases might have been tainted by police corruption, leading to a massive review of convictions that involved officers from my father's unit. The work that my father had dismissed as helping criminals escape justice was actually helping innocent people escape the consequences of his criminal behavior. The psychological impact of destroying my own father's career and freedom had been complex and difficult to process. While I felt satisfaction at seeing justice served and innocent people exonerated, I also grieved for the father I'd thought I knew and the family relationships that had been permanently destroyed. Therapy had been essential for helping me understand that my loyalty should be to victims of injustice rather than to family members who were perpetrating injustice. The federal prosecutors handling the case had praised my courage in exposing corruption despite the personal cost, and my cooperation with their investigation had been recognized as instrumental in achieving justice for victims of police misconduct. The Attorney General's office had invited me to consult on developing better procedures for detecting and preventing police corruption, work that felt like a meaningful way to honor the principles my father had claimed to represent but had actually violated. My father's plea negotiations had been unsuccessful because federal prosecutors were unwilling to offer significant sentence reductions to someone whose corruption was so extensive and systematic. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his continued refusal to accept full responsibility for his crimes had eliminated any possibility of cooperative agreements that might have reduced his punishment. The trial was scheduled to begin in 6 months, and my testimony as the primary witness against my father would be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The son who'd been called the biggest disgrace to the family would be responsible for sending the real family disgrace to prison for the rest of his life, completing the reversal of our family's moral hierarchy that had begun with his cruel words at his retirement party. 8 months after my father's retirement party explosion, I was sitting in federal court as the star witness in United States v. Robert Sterling, watching as prosecutors methodically presented evidence that would send my father to prison for the rest of his life. The trial had attracted national media attention as an example of how police corruption could persist for decades and how family loyalty sometimes required exposing rather than protecting criminal relatives. The prosecution's case was overwhelming and comprehensive, built around the evidence I'd initially provided but expanded through months of federal investigation that had uncovered additional crimes and victims. FBI forensic accountants had traced over $400,000 in unexplained income that my father had received through bribes, kickbacks, and theft from evidence lockers. Digital forensics experts had recovered deleted emails and text messages that documented coordination with other corrupt officers and explicit acknowledgement of criminal behavior. But perhaps the most devastating testimony came from the innocent people who'd been imprisoned based on my father's fraudulent police work. David Chen, whose case had started my investigation, testified about spending 18 months in prison for a robbery he didn't commit while my father knew the real perpetrator was still free. Maria Gonzalez described how Detective Sterling had threatened to have her children taken away if she didn't falsely identify a suspect in a shooting case. James Wilson explained how my father had planted drugs in his car and then offered to lose the evidence in exchange for information about his neighbors. The defense strategy had been predictable but pathetic, focusing on portraying my father as a dedicated officer who'd occasionally bent rules to protect society from dangerous criminals. His attorney argued that any evidence tampering had been motivated by genuine belief in suspects' guilt and that witness intimidation was actually aggressive but legitimate interrogation techniques. The arguments were undermined by recorded conversations where my father explicitly acknowledged framing people he knew were innocent. My testimony as the prosecution's key witness had been emotionally devastating but professionally satisfying. For 3 days, I'd walked the jury through the evidence I'd collected, explaining how each piece of documentation proved systematic corruption rather than isolated mistakes or overzealous investigation. The defense's attempt to portray me as a vindictive son seeking revenge had backfired when my professionalism and expertise became evident through cross-examination. The most powerful moment of my testimony came when prosecutors played the recorded conversation where my father and Detective Santos discussed which innocent suspects to frame and which criminals to protect based on their value as informants or sources of income. Hearing my father's voice casually planning to destroy innocent lives for personal gain was devastating for everyone in the courtroom, but it was particularly heartbreaking for Marcus, who was hearing definitive proof that his hero was actually a monster. The jury deliberation lasted only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 43 federal charges. The conviction meant that my father would face a sentence of at least 40 years in federal prison, effectively ensuring that he would die behind bars. The man who'd called me the biggest disgrace to our family had been convicted by a unanimous jury of crimes that made him the real disgrace. Not just to our family, but to every principle of justice and integrity he'd claimed to represent. The sentencing hearing 3 months later was equally devastating, as victim after victim testified about how my father's corruption had destroyed their lives and families. Former defendants spoke about losing jobs, homes, and relationships during wrongful imprisonment. Family members described the trauma of watching innocent loved ones sent to prison while knowing the system was supposed to protect them. The cumulative impact of my father's crimes was staggering in its scope and cruelty. Federal Judge Patricia Hamilton delivered a sentence that reflected the severity and systematic nature of my father's crimes. 55 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, plus restitution payments totaling $8.2 million to compensate victims for wrongful imprisonment, lost income, and emotional damages. At age 58, my father would spend the rest of his life in the same prison system he'd been feeding through fraudulent arrests for decades. The civil lawsuits filed by exonerated defendants had resulted in settlements that exceeded $20 million, money that came from taxpayer funds and police pension accounts. The financial impact on our city's budget was severe enough to force cuts in municipal services and increases in local taxes. My father's corruption hadn't just destroyed individual lives, it had imposed costs on every citizen who'd trusted their police department to operate with integrity. Detective Maria Santos and 3 other officers implicated in the corruption scheme had also received significant prison sentences, ranging from 12 to 25 years depending on their level of involvement. The entire detective unit where my father had worked was disbanded and its cases reviewed for evidence of additional corruption. The scandal had fundamentally changed how our city's police department operated, with new oversight procedures and integrity protocols designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. My brother Marcus had requested early discharge from the military, unable to continue serving in an institution that represented honor and duty while bearing the name of someone who'd systematically violated both principles. His decision to leave the career he'd loved was one of the most tragic consequences of our father's crimes, as Marcus lost not just his father but also his professional identity and future plans. The impact on our extended family had been complete and permanent. Relatives who'd been proud to associate with a decorated police detective now avoided any mention of our family name. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents had distanced themselves from the scandal, choosing to protect their own reputations rather than maintain relationships with people connected to such extensive criminal behavior. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was how the legal community had embraced my role in exposing police corruption and protecting innocent victims. The American Bar Association had presented me with their Criminal Justice Award for courage in pursuing justice despite personal cost. Several law schools had invited me to lecture about ethics, family loyalty, and the responsibility to expose corruption even when it involves people we love. My law practice had evolved to focus exclusively on police misconduct and wrongful conviction cases, work that felt deeply meaningful after my experience with family corruption. The expertise I developed through investigating my father's crimes had made me a sought-after attorney for defendants who suspected they'd been victimized by corrupt law enforcement. Every case I won felt like additional justice for what my father had done to innocent people. The financial recovery from civil lawsuits had also allowed me to establish a foundation that provided legal assistance to wrongfully convicted defendants who couldn't afford experienced attorneys. The organization, named the Sterling Justice Foundation in ironic honor of my father's surname, had already helped exonerate 12 innocent people whose cases involved police misconduct similar to what I'd exposed in my father's unit. The psychological healing from destroying my own father's career and freedom had been gradual and complex, requiring extensive therapy to process the guilt, grief, and satisfaction that came from such a profound family betrayal. Understanding that my loyalty belonged to justice rather than to family members who violated justice had been essential for moving forward with my life and career. My romantic relationship had also flourished since the trial ended, as my partner David had been amazed by my courage in exposing corruption despite the personal cost. Our relationship was built on shared values of integrity and justice that had been tested and proven through the most difficult circumstances imaginable. We were planning to marry next year, creating a new family based on authentic values rather than the false principles that had defined my childhood. The media attention from the case had gradually diminished, but the impact on police accountability and criminal justice reform continued to resonate nationally. My father's case had become a textbook example of how corruption could persist for decades and how family members sometimes needed to choose justice over loyalty. Law enforcement agencies across the country had implemented new procedures based on lessons learned from our city's corruption scandal. The most meaningful outcome was the restoration of freedom and dignity to innocent people who'd been victimized by my father's criminal behavior. Watching David Chin graduate from college after his exoneration, seeing Maria Gonzalez reunited with her children after charges were dropped, and learning that James Wilson had found stable employment after his record was cleared made every painful moment of the investigation and trial worthwhile. But the personal cost of exposing my father's corruption had been severe and permanent. The man who'd raised me no longer existed in any meaningful sense. He'd been replaced by an aging criminal serving life in federal prison, someone I had no desire to visit or communicate with. The father-son relationship that had been damaged by years of criticism and disappointment was now completely severed by the reality of his crimes and my role in exposing them. Marcus and I had gradually rebuilt our relationship based on shared understanding that we'd both been victims of our father's deception and manipulation. Our bond as brothers had been strengthened by surviving the trauma of learning that our moral compass had actually been a criminal whose guidance had been based on lies. We supported each other through therapy and the slow process of building new identities that weren't defined by our father's reputation. 3 years have passed since my father called me the biggest disgrace to our family at his retirement party, and today I'm writing this from my law office, where a photo on my desk shows me receiving the Department of Justice's award for outstanding service in civil rights enforcement. The irony couldn't be more perfect. The son who was dismissed as a disgrace for defending criminals is now being honored by the federal government for exposing the real criminal, a corrupt police detective whose systematic abuse of power had victimized innocent people for decades. The most meaningful development has been watching how my courage in exposing family corruption has inspired other people to come forward with evidence of misconduct by relatives in positions of authority. The Sterling case, as it's become known in legal circles, has been cited in dozens of subsequent police corruption investigations where family members provided the initial evidence that led to criminal prosecutions. My decision to choose justice over family loyalty has created a precedent that continues to protect innocent people from abuse by corrupt officials. My law practice has become one of the most respected firms in the country for police misconduct and wrongful conviction cases, with clients traveling from across the nation to seek representation from someone who understands corruption from both personal and professional perspectives. The expertise I developed through investigating my own father has been instrumental in exposing systematic abuse in police departments from California to New York, resulting in hundreds of exonerations and millions of dollars in compensation for victims. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my current success is how it has completely vindicated the career choices my father spent years criticizing. The criminal defense work he mocked as morally questionable has become the foundation for exposing and preventing the kind of corruption he embodied. Every innocent person I help exonerate is validation that my profession serves justice rather than undermining it, and every corrupt officer I help prosecute proves that my legal work protects society rather than endangering it. My relationship with Marcus has been fully restored and strengthened through our shared experience of surviving family trauma and rebuilding our identities around authentic values rather than false hero worship. Marcus eventually found meaningful work with a veterans organization that helps former military personnel transition to civilian careers, work that allows him to serve others without the institutional authority that our father had corrupted. Our brotherhood is now based on mutual respect and shared commitment to integrity rather than competition for parental approval. The Sterling Justice Foundation has grown into a nationally recognized organization that provides legal assistance to wrongfully convicted defendants and lobbies for criminal justice reforms that prevent police corruption. The foundation has helped exonerate 47 innocent people in 3 years, work that feels like the most meaningful possible use of my legal skills and personal experience with corruption. Every case we win is additional justice for what my father did to innocent victims. The financial success of my legal practice has also allowed me to establish a scholarship program for law students who want to specialize in criminal defense and civil rights work but can't afford the reduced income that often comes with public interest law. The scholarships are named in honor of David Chen and the other innocent people my father victimized, ensuring that their suffering contributes to preventing similar injustices in the future. My marriage to David last year was one of the most joyful experiences of my life, representing the creation of a new family based on authentic love and shared values rather than the conditional acceptance and hidden corruption that had characterized my childhood. Our relationship has been strengthened by surviving the most difficult circumstances imaginable, and we're now expecting our first child, a son who will grow up understanding that real integrity sometimes requires difficult choices that disappoint people we love. The media attention from my father's case has evolved from scandal coverage to recognition of the positive changes it inspired in police accountability and family loyalty ethics. I've been invited to speak at law schools, police academies, and ethics conferences about the responsibility to expose corruption even when it involves family members. The message that justice must transcend personal relationships has resonated with audiences who understand that institutional corruption persists partly because good people choose loyalty over accountability. My father's current situation serves as a constant reminder of the consequences that await people who abuse positions of trust and authority. At age 61, he's serving his 55-year sentence in federal prison, where his status as a former police officer makes him a target for the same kind of violence he once inflicted on innocent suspects. His requests for family visits have been consistently refused, as both Marcus and I have chosen to maintain no contact with someone whose criminal behavior destroyed everything we once believed about family and integrity. The appeals process for his conviction has been unsuccessful, as federal courts have consistently upheld both his conviction and sentence based on the overwhelming evidence of systematic corruption and the severity of his crimes. His attorney's arguments about excessive punishment have been rejected by judges who recognize that long sentences are necessary to deter other officers from similar behavior and to acknowledge the profound damage caused by systematic abuse of police authority. The civil lawsuits filed by my father's victims continue to be resolved through settlements that now exceed $30 million, money that comes from police pension funds and municipal insurance policies. The financial impact has forced our city to implement comprehensive police reform measures, including civilian oversight boards, mandatory body cameras, and independent prosecutors for police misconduct cases. My father's corruption has paradoxically led to the most significant police accountability improvements in our city's history. The psychological healing from choosing justice over family loyalty has been gradual but complete, helped by therapy, meaningful work, and relationships with people who share my values. Understanding that my father's corruption was a choice rather than a mistake has been essential for moving beyond guilt about exposing him and embracing pride in protecting his victims. The man who raised me to value honesty and justice would have wanted me to expose corruption, even if the corrupt person was him. But perhaps the most profound realization has been that my father's retirement party attack on my character was actually the best thing that ever happened to my career and personal integrity. His public humiliation of me triggered my decision to expose corruption that might have continued for years if I'd remained silent. The cruel words that were intended to shame me into changing careers instead launched me into the most meaningful and successful period of my professional life. So here's my question for everyone who's followed this incredible journey from family humiliation to national recognition. Have you ever had someone attack your values so viciously that their cruelty forced you to prove those values were exactly right? Sometimes the people who try to shame us for our principles are actually revealing that our principles threaten their corruption, and their attacks become the catalyst for exposing truth they desperately want to hide. My father's declaration that I was the biggest disgrace to our family was intended to pressure me into changing careers and abandoning the work that was unknowingly threatening his criminal behavior. Instead, it became the moment when I realized that the real disgrace was the corrupt police officer who'd been systematically destroying innocent lives while lecturing his son about honor and justice. If this story has resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family corruption, police misconduct, and the courage required to choose justice over loyalty. Share this video with anyone who's ever been criticized for standing up to authority figures, or anyone who's discovered that doing the right thing sometimes means disappointing people you love. Drop a comment telling me about your own experiences with corruption in families or institutions, or times when exposing difficult truths led to positive changes that protected innocent people. Thank you for joining me on this journey from family disgrace to justice advocate. Remember that sometimes the people who call you a disgrace are projecting their own shame about their behavior, and that real family loyalty means protecting innocent people from family members who abuse their authority. The retirement party where I was called the biggest disgrace became the beginning of exposing who the real disgrace was, and proving that courage and integrity are more important than family approval when justice is at stake.